Live. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Sure.
sure.
Okay.
On X or what?
Facebook.
If you'd like, I can share it. So
That'd be perfect. Okay, I think I am live now.
you are.
We'll just
Yep.
give this a minute. I know there's always a lag on here, so
Sure.
um,
So it's Blake Roberts on Facebook, and we're gonna share this out to the world. Oh,
okay,
I see you there.
okay. So anybody that's watching this, it's going to be recorded as well. I guess first, gentlemen, if I why don't you introduce yourselves, and then I'll kind of get into what we're going to talk about and why.
Sure. I guess I'll start off. I'm Steve Pelech. I'm a professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of British Columbia, where I've been on faculty for about 38 years. I'm a biochemist, and I'm also the founder of two biotech companies, and the most recent would be Connexus Bioinformatics Corporation. And in that company, we've done services for about 2,000 labs in 35 countries. And that included doing a large clinical study looking at the SARS-CoV-2 virus immune response. And more recently, I did some work with the eggs that contain antibodies from the ostriches on the farm in near Vernon. And that's sort of my background. I'm also the co-chair of the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee of the Canadian Citizens Care Alliance, of which Dr. David Speicher is also a member. Or David?
I, I'm a molecular virologist who obviously stutters, but I don't let it slow me down. I have a PhD in virology from Griffith in Australia. Yeah, I've done research in Australia, Africa, India, Cambodia on a range of viral infections, bacteria as well. In the COVID-19 pandemic, I was a lab director of two PCR testing sites. Um, and I have looked at 44 vials of the COVID-19 vaccine, Pfizer and Moderna, and found and have a peer reviewed paper showing high levels of plasmid DNA and SV40 sequences in the shots, which basically show fraud by the COVID manufacturers. On that, we received a second letter from Retraction Watch yesterday to try and discredit our work. And there's a clear link between the science that we're doing and the convoy and the farm is that if you're on scientific fact and stand up against the world powers, you will be sidelined and silenced to the point of being killed. So there's a big link between what's going on with the vaccines and the farm and the government.
David, I have a question for you. I was at an
Oh,
event yesterday that I
yep.
attended at the University of British Columbia put on. And one of the questions that came up was with the contamination of the COVID-19 RNA vaccines with the DNA, which,
Yep.
people do acknowledge, it's a fact. But the response was, well, there's 30 micrograms in, let's say, the Pfizer Moderna vaccine
Mhm.
of RNA, but you have less than a microgram of DNA. So it's a very small, inconsequential amount relative to the total amount of RNA. So what would you say in response to that?
Well, if it's all naked DNA of the right size, that then we're okay. Except these are fragments up to 3.5 kb in length. Full length spike is there. It's it it's all inside lipid nanoparticles being transfected into our cells, and we're told, oh, it's just fragmented. It's not bioactive, so it's no big deal. And the safety goalposts keep being changed. In 1986, the guidelines for DNA in a DNA-based vaccine was 10 picograms per dose. In 1996, it's up to 10 nanograms per dose, and it's all for naked DNA, and it's not for DNA packaged in a lipid nanoparticle as well. There's a 1999 David Dean research which shows if you take fragmented DNA attached to a 72 base pair SV40 and enhancer, and put 3 to 10 copies of those into a non-dividing cell which has an intact nuclear envelope. There's a good potential, and it's been shown to occur. Those fragments can cross the nuclear envelope and integrate themselves into the genome of that cell. So there's a big risk. It's known, and we're told, well, yes, it's a risk. If it's there, then where is it? And when you inject these things into someone, they go to multiple sites. So, is it in a tumor cell? Is it a heart, liver, a brain, is it in sperm cells? And so we're currently looking to see if we can find things. it doesn't negate the fact that these shots were rushed. They were not evaluated right first, and they have caused people harm.
Oh, so David, just to put it in perspective for your audience, when you were saying picogram amounts of DNA, we're talking about 1 millionth of a microgram.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about the nanograms, we're talking about 1,000th of a microgram. And then there would be 30 micrograms again in the vaccine. So we should let Blake actually ask the questions here now.
I'm sorry, Blake.
No, you know what, guys? And I say guys rather than doctors as I'm addressing you
Yeah.
because I've talked a little bit and I feel so anybody watching this, we're getting to listen in on two science geeks. As we always argue over at coffee, any of us that we talk about COVID, we talk about the ostriches, we're just people. Now we're listening to two people that know what they're talking about rather than us. So
Mm,
again, guys, thank you very much for doing this because
you're
as
welcome.
as we've talked before, as we've texted in the past, if anybody remembers, Dr. Pelech was good enough to do a Zoom with me in early October, and then Dr. Speicher's name came across my table right about the same time. Um, One of the things that frustrated me is that as we jump into the ostrich thing and what was going on, anybody like me on the news, all we ever saw was the narrative of people in your field that agreed with the cult. That's all
Mhm.
we ever see. We never see you. And to Joe Q Public, and my 92-year-old aunt is one of them, she would always say, basically, well, of course they have to kill the ostriches, and she quotes what she heard. And I'd say, well, okay, there's other experts that have a different opinion because science isn't exact. And I'm going to stop, Stephen. I appreciate what you just said, Blake, but I know this is about you guys. Um, when I was at the farm in September, because I had such a big mouth on Facebook, CTV News out of Toronto couldn't get a hold of anybody that was actually in the family. So they found me on Facebook, phoned me. I ended up doing a couple lives from the farm. I asked them then, because I had talked to you, Dr. Pelech, already. I said, hey, would you consider talking to Dr. Pelech because he has a different view on this? No interest. They were busy. And then they went AWOL on me. I asked them a couple more times over the next 10 or 11 days. Didn't hear from them until the morning of the when the stay order was refused. Suddenly they called and wanted to do a story on what was about to happen. But to get to the public another point of view on this thing, they had no interest in. And it's unfortunate that this my Facebook reach, whatever it might be, is where you should be on CBC and CTV. I even hate to say their names. So um,
Well, I have had CBC reporters interview me before with during the COVID-19 situation, and they even had stories ready to go. But the senior editors it in CBC that at the national headquarters nixed it because the narrative wasn't supporting the narrative that was coming from the government.
Mhm.
And that reporter was very upset. She eventually decided after about 28 years to retire and she was very outspoken afterwards at the National Citizens Inquiry. And she's one of actually several other people formerly associated with CBC that they found that they weren't able to get the stories out. And I believe that probably a lot of the reporters that are out there in these major news organizations can smell the story and they want to be more balanced, but I think they're being prevented. And I think the situation is when you're two-thirds of your salary, if you're in CBC, is coming from the government. And for most of the major news outlets, about one-third of your salary is from government support. then you're pretty reluctant to have a narrative that's going to contradict what it is that the government's message wants to be. So I'm not surprised by this, but fortunately, the truth prevails. I always say it's kind of like the wind in my sails, and it may not be very popular at the time I say it, but I think history will vindicate, as it has for David and myself, and some of the other things that we said in the past, that yes, and it's coming around, and we're seeing the US government, for example, the National Institutes of Health and the FDA, now coming out with statements based on science, because the same people are essentially there in terms of the scientists. You just have different people as the administrators. And now the information is coming out about, the connections, for example, just yesterday between vaccination and autism. So it's true that that correlation doesn't mean causation, but correlation tells you that you should be paying much more attention to that being a potential factor in whatever disease that you're looking at in this case. And so, finally, we're starting to take it a bit more seriously in the States. And I think this will eventually rub off on the rest of the world, and Canada included.
Can we got political, and I guess I should have known we were going to get a little political the way this conversation was going to go when we talked before we started. Do you recall the name of the reporter that you said resigned from the CBC because your story?
Yes. Geez, I got a little mental block here. Marianne, uh, uh, oh, I want to say, um, geez.
Okay, I'll
Marianne is
find
her
it.
first name,
I'll,
and
I'll
uh,
find it if it comes to you. That's fine.
starts with a K. She was with
Yeah.
CBC Winnipeg,
Okay.
and yeah, she was very outspoken about this, and but there's been other CBC reporters as well that have actually come out
Mayor
on this.
Rand Klovac.
Klovac, that's right.
Slovak. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Klowak.
Okay. Um,
Klovac,
so
yeah.
as as we jumped into vaccines and I guess policies and the science that's not exact as we said, um, Dr. Pelech, when we talked in October, can you just refresh everybody? Because you talked at the time that 15% of the flock have died,
Mhm.
and I guess where I'm going with this story is I ramble. I'm not a reporter.
Mhm.
um, the What's frustrating to me and so many others is the big media have trotted out experts in this field, or not even experts, as you pointed out, one that may not be
Right.
as versed in virology as they would be, but still CBC quoted.
Mhm.
We're people like me. We're seeing even experts that wanted this to happen state the birds are healthy, but we had to do this. Can you talk to people, tell people why they were healthy and why both of you and Dr. Speaker as well, why they were healthy and why we didn't have to do this?
Sure. I mean, this is the difficulty for when you have someone with some scientific training that's, potentially an educator. When they're making statements, they do have to be a little careful, because if they're saying something which is outright, just false, then that's in a sense the kiss of death for credibility of that scientist.
Hmm.
I mean, for scientists in general, we are expected to be honest and factual and critical in our thinking. And so if we make statements that are just so outrageous, we don't just lose the respect of, the general public, we lose the respect of our peers.
Hmm.
So one has to be extremely careful with what someone says. Now, the facts of the matter is that in December of last year, the CFI has a policy that if any bird tests positive with a PCR test, and I should preface that that PCR test has about a 90% false positive rate at high cycle thresholds. That is the number of times you have to amplify up the genetic material. And David can speak to that more than anybody else here. The reality is that they were testing for H5 and H7. This is the hemagglutinin protein on the surface of the virus that allows the virus to attach to cells so they can infect the cells and replicate. And as it turns out, the H5 and H7 hemagglutinin forms are not very good for infecting mammalian cells, but they're optimized for infecting birds. So this is why they're testing specifically for those two markers. And in the H5N1 virus has been known for well over 64 years now. And it's important to understand that there have been cases in the past of people who have died from an H5N1 infection, but it's very rare. And most of the cases have been in Southeast Asia, where they not necessarily had good access to medical care. Now, in North America, we've had maybe two, maybe three cases, no, two cases of people who've died from H5N1 in probably the last 15 years in North America. And the number of total cases we're talking about is probably less than maybe 70, 80 cases of where they confirm the person's actually had H5N1. And so in North America, I mean, the lethality rate of the H5N1 is actually about the same as you would expect with regular influenza in a person. So it's a very, very low risk of getting it in the first place, but if you get it, it's very rare. However, birds are very susceptible to it, and we have a high pathogenicity version, which by definition means that if you have an infection, you're expecting about 85% of the birds that are in that group that are exposed to that virus are going to die. And so the policy of the Canada Food Inspection Agency is if you get a positive test with either H5 or H7, then you call the entire herd. And this policy has been applied for several years, well, actually decades, but with H5N1, we've killed off certainly more than 14.5 million birds in Canada. The US has adopted a similar policy. They've killed off over 160 million birds, mainly chickens and geese and ducks that are on farms. This does not include any of the animals in the wild. So this farm, with two dead birds that have been sitting on the ground for probably over a day, they tested using this very high sensitive test for the presence of H5, H7, and they got a positive result in the two birds. And that was sufficient that within 41 minutes of getting that information, that a call order happened for the farm, that they're just going to kill all the birds. And normally in the poultry industry, the compensation is pretty good. A farmer might get $4 or $5 for a chicken normally, and they get compensated to an equivalent level. So it's disruptive, but from a standpoint of the viability of the farm, if they have all their birds culled, at some point all birds are going to be killed anyways. So, you know, there hasn't been that much of an uprising from farms. But as it turns out, it has been devastating for many poultry farms. Anyways, the situation though is the birds were not tested for N1, and they were not tested that they had high pathogenicity virus. Most of the influenza virus that's even in the birds is of low pathogenicity. And there's a reason for this. In nature, in order to spread, a virus does not want to kill its host. It wants to be able to infect and replicate. And if the host is not particularly ill, then it's easier for that virus to spread to other birds. And that's exactly what's happened. It's the same thing happened during COVID, where we had a bit more of a lethal version originally, the Wuhan strain, but it mutated, and the earlier strains were displaced by the newer strains. Eventually, the Omicron strain was very, very infectious, but relatively benign. So as a consequence, it just completely displaced the more pathogenic virus. So this is what's been happening probably in the wild birds. And what actually infected the birds on the farm was a hybrid. The genome of this virus is actually cut into 8 separate pieces. And if you have 2 different strains of influenza infecting the same bird and the very same cells, then it creates a situation, what we call reassortment. And so you can get a hybrid virus. So later, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, using the original samples, and this was done at the Winnipeg National Microbiology Lab, they determined that this was actually the virus that had recovered from the bird. And I'd say, when I say recovered from the bird, it wasn't the virus they actually recovered from the bird. It was some of the genetic material from that virus, which was actually analyzed. And they determined that it was a hybrid between a low pathogenicity virus strain and the H5N1 higher pathogenicity strain. And usually when you have such a mix of strains, you don't result in a more dangerous virulent virus. You actually result in generally what would be a more benign virus. So this probably accounts for why only 15% of the birds that were on that farm actually died. They died early on, about 69 of the birds. But after January the 14th, there were no more deaths. In fact, the birds were very healthy, and they went on for 10 months. So we know for sure that it was a low pathogenicity virus that infected these birds. And so the narrative that has come from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is that, this is a new reassortment we've never seen before in Canada. And the reassortment involves a strain of the H5N1 called the D1.3 strain. Most of the strains have been a D1.1 strain. And so this D1.3 strain has been observed in the United States, in fact, even in October of last year, and had been spreading, and it infected even some cows. And there was one person that was involved in a large call operation in the United States in actually February of this year. And that person tested positive, was mildly ill, and they had the D1.3 strain. So the narrative that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has put forward is that this was a unique reassortment, that strain, not actually the strain that was in the birds. Yeah, I have to make that clear. But part of that strain that was in the birds, the D1.3, showed up in a person that got infected. And so the narrative is that spread from the farm. And so they're thinking that they're pushing the idea that the farm is ground zero for this new hybrid strain that is now spread through into the United States. And that's just completely false. Mm. And then they also made a comment after, just before it was going to the Supreme Court, that the bird strain had been tested by the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg, and it was shown to be more lethal in killing mice, probably transgenic mice that have been altered so that they are able to be infected by this strain of an avian strain of H5N1. And that information was provided to the courts, and it was hearsay information. There was no documentation whatsoever. And it was just a claim that one of the scientists that was at the National Microbiology Lab had made this observation that the D1.3 strain was killing the cells better than a strain that they had recovered from a cow. But actually, there was no isolation from what we can see from any documentation of the virus that infected the birds, the
Yeah.
actual virus, not just little pieces of degraded material, was actually ever propagated in the laboratory in Winnipeg or tested in the laboratory in Winnipeg. And as far as we know, the virus that infected the ostriches was never tested for pathogenicity ever. So, but when the narrative is given by the CFI, they put all these little facts out, and then they try to stitch it together to give a story that's completely misleading. And this is what really upsets me. That we had this tremendous opportunity to really study an infection, and they said that there was this unique reassortment. Only in court did they admit that there is 100 different reassortments that have been documented by the Canada Food Inspection Agency with the Winnipeg laboratory. And in the scientific literature, and just in the last couple of years, there's been over 100 reported in the literature of these kind of reassortments. So, again, it's creating this scenario that's scaring the public into thinking that, oh, this is going to be the cause of the next pandemic that's going to be replacing COVID-19, and that we have to nip it at its bud. But meanwhile, you've got tens of thousands of migratory birds flying across North America, a lot of them through British Columbia, landing on the ponds and lakes and shorelines and the parks and the schoolyards in our cities, dropping their excrement everywhere, which will have virus in it. And yet we have had only one case of H5N1 in a human in Canada in over a decade. So, this is just ridiculous. So it's very long-winded, but it gives you a good
Yeah.
overview of what's going on.
No, and what you just explained, Doctor, on CBC and CTV, they talked about the mutation,
That's
and you
right.
just said, and they just talk about that part, and that's all that the public sees. They don't hear what you just said about what was acknowledged in
Yeah.
court.
Yeah.
But they sequenced the whole genome of the virus. They stitched it together, and they showed that it had none of the mutations that increase the ability of the virus to infect a mammal. So they even ruled out those mutations are actually in that virus. I mean, the reality is any virus can undergo mutation that
Right.
might allow it to become more pathogenic, but it doesn't compete very well. And if I was concerned about the next pandemic that's going to infect the human population, it wouldn't be H5N1. It'd be an H1 or H2 or H3 virus, which are the ones that infect mammals.
Mhm.
And the big pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu, that was an H1N1. So, H5 and H7 have never been of much concern. And even the CFIA itself acknowledges that if you eat meat or products that are from birds that have been infected with H5N1, you're perfectly safe.
And that's
So
right on the Government of Canada
it's on their
website.
website.
Yep.
I
Yes.
Googled it, just cook it to the right temperature.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. In fact, the influenza virus itself is an RNA virus, and it's transmitted in an aerosol. You have to be next to a person or an animal that's actually infected, and it's breathing out these aerosolized virus, and then you breathe it in. It's not a virus that's easily transmitted off of surfaces, from the ground or for touching surfaces. Influenza does not spread very well that way. And it's very sensitive to UV light, like sunlight.
Mhm.
And it's also dries out very easily. It has a lipid membrane around it that it can just without water, it'll just dry out. If you have it in water, like drinking water, it gets so diluted out that it's just you're not getting enough of a viral load to actually cause a full infection of a person. Their immune system usually can take it out pretty quick.
So when I, so the, we're hearing on the news, I think secondhand, but the farm is still technically a little quarantined.
Yeah.
Things have to be cleaned up in there. Does that make a lot of sense to you, or is that
No, it's
overkill in
been
baseball, what you're
absolutely
saying?
it's
No,
it is embarrassing actually
it is.
seeing how this whole operation was conducted. I mean, firstly, they built these large hay walls to create a kill pen, and they're supposed to be were supposed to have killed these animals, culled them in the most humane way possible. And so this is what they actually did. Firstly, again, I have no data available to support this in terms of anything that's published. But I suspect that these birds were highly drugged during that 6 weeks. And I say that because normally when you have these ostriches, and they're can be 9 feet tall, over 300 pounds, with these feet that are like a velociraptor. They're basically used for their protection. Lions don't take on ostriches, and ostriches are they're spooked very easily. It takes years before a handler is able to walk amongst the ostriches in a way that their safety isn't at risk. And these birds were subjected to drones. They didn't have their handlers around. They weren't fed the same way. They were being chased around by probably at least the drones in the sky scared them. They were running into fences, injuring themselves. So this was a panicked flock of birds for a 6 week period. And the only way you'd be able to have those birds relatively docile is to drug them. And passerbys, people that were at the site that were watching these ostriches, and I certainly talked to the owners about this, they could tell that their birds were not behaving normal. They were very sedated. Okay. So they led the birds with the food, which was not given to them. Well, first it wasn't their regular food, and then later it wasn't given to them in the proper way that they were used to, but they were led to the food being in the pens. And so the CFI waited till it was dark, and then they figure from the people who've recorded this, anything between 750 to 1,000 rounds were fired by, they believe, around five uh, professional, marksmen, and that shooting went on for a couple of hours. And then what happened was the next day there was more shooting, indicating that they had not successfully killed all the birds. So these birds were basically seeing the other birds in their flock being killed. They're highly panicked. It's in the dark. They're probably um, not being killed instantly, but actually most of them are probably in their bodies because the heads do move around a lot, and it's hard to take a shot in the dark. And so they suffered. They suffered really badly. And then what ended up happening was
Mm.
the birds were all covered over, most of them. So it was hard to get an actual number of the total number of birds that were actually killed. But the observations have been that there has been weird activity going on in the nights before the kill, where trucks would come in and out, and from when they could see the birds, it seemed like there was a deficiency of the hens and more of the male birds that were left behind. And so the counts, no, the CFIA didn't allow even the RCMP to release data on the number of birds that were at the farm, but the number of birds that seemed to have been executed during that final call seems quite a bit short, maybe by over 100 birds from what there should have been. So, so the thought is that some of these birds were actually killed during the period of time that the Supreme Court had put a stay order. So that's a bit suspicious. Then these birds were put into trucks, which were covered over so that nobody could see what the trucks were with cardboard over the identification features, with drivers that weren't wearing hazmat suits or anything, driving hundreds of miles down into Surrey, British Columbia,
Mm-hmm.
onto a Save-On parking lot, apparently. And we don't know what's happening with that. Now, when these birds were shot, their blood was spilled all over the kill pen. And because of all the trucks that were on the site outside the kill pen, there's very deep, muddy areas. And so what they did was they took the hay from the kill pen and they spread it over the rest of the site. And so if the CFIA itself is claiming that this is a contamination zone, then they're actually making the zone much bigger by spreading this. Now, I don't really think there's a problem here because, again, the virus doesn't last very long with microbial action and sunlight. But it's contrary to the narrative that they've expressed, and even the RCMP that went into the quarantine zone were not wearing hazmat suits. And quite often, when people were wearing hazmat suits and coming out of the zone, they were traveling back to where they were staying overnight. Sometimes, no decontamination of the vehicles that are going in and out of this zone. I mean, it's like what they say and what they do
Mm-hmm.
have been completely contradictory. And this is it's incredible. It's like the list that has been put together. These animals have not been humanely killed or cared for.
Mm.
The zone, if they're claiming it's such a problem, they weren't actually following their own policies in terms of biosecurity. And then you have a situation where just was it really necessary to kill these healthy birds 10 months? If they were even 2 months had gone by, they would have been declared disease-free according to the World Organization for Animal Health. And the claim is that, well, these birds, they're jeopardizing the trade, international trade in poultry products from British Columbia, because for some countries like Russia and Mexico, which are really minor markets for our birds, it turns out that if any facility in British Columbia has a H5N1 infection, then you lose the disease-free status for British Columbia. However, since October the 14th, we've already had more than 20 outbreaks in British Columbia of H5N1 on farms. So the disease status was irrelevant. And in fact, the farm itself was in its own zone. So for the rest of the year, for most of our trade, most of which goes to the United States, there was no handicap to, for example, the sale of poultry products from anywhere else in British Columbia during
Well,
that.
that's another thing that you just say. Again, we see on the news where other scientific experts say that this farm is jeopardizing international trade.
No,
You,
and
people
the
like
trade
me,
went up.
we never, trade was up. I saw 4%. You just start
That's right.
digging deep, but most people don't. They follow the news. And we're being misled.
Yeah,
And it sounds like a
Exactly.
conspiracy theory. And people like me, here's an interesting thing. And tell me if if my question this makes no sense, but our country follows the stamping out uh, protocol or recommendations, whatever they are, of the World Organization for Animal Health.
Supposedly.
So two things. I've heard that the World Organization for Animal Health doesn't insist on this, correct? Or was that
That's correct. You have two options. And again, these are guidelines. These guidelines are drawn up by about 70 different countries with organizations like the Canadian Food Inspection Agency that are members. And they draw up these guidelines for countries to help guide trade. And and so they want to give some sort of sense of protection when you have these products that are being internationally traded, that they're safe. And so the guideline is that, and it's very interesting. If you went back last year and you looked at the guidelines, if you had an H5N1 outbreak in a zone, then you had to wait 3 months with testing to show that there is no evidence of a persistence of that infection within that zone. And if so, then you have disease-free status. Now, that changed in the last year to 1 month. So you only have to wait a month after a call order and killing all the animals in a zone to get disease-free status. At the same time, if you have a zone and you do what's called a burnout, you let the virus take its course, whatever animals die, and those that recover, if there's no other outbreak in a year, then you also have disease-free status. Now, the whole problem with this culling is it's based on the premise that the virus can spread from one farm to another farm and, within a zone. And this is a way to contain the spread. But the problem is that a lot of the birds that are going to be infected, if you are in a zone, the likelihood that they're going to come to another farm means that you have to have a person or some animal transmit it between those farms in order to get that spread of the virus through the commercial farms. The reality is that most of that virus spread and infection of the farms is coming from the wild animals, of which there are no restrictions. So we have these so-called disease-free zones that, in fact, most of the virus is spreading just outside the farm itself, in the air by the wild animals that are on the land or the birds that are flying in the air and land, in and near these farms. And you can't prevent that from happening, as is well demonstrated by the fact that we've had more than 500 and I guess 50 outbreaks now just in the last 4 or 5 years in Canada on farms with H5N1. And they're not from other farms. They're from wild animals.
Oh, that's the, and I've talked to chicken farmers in the Fraser Valley, and where they're having the outbreak there, all the farms, they've got a heavy concentration of the wild geese. And the farms that
Yeah.
don't have the wild geese aren't the ones they're not being hit.
Well, the interesting thing is when you look at the call, and Drea Humphreys did an interview with Rebel News right after the call happened in the morning, and she was walking out of the farmhouse, and as she was walking along, there was all these wild turkeys flying around, right? I mean, they weren't killing the turkeys.
They're everywhere in that community. They're everywhere.
Yeah.
Question I had, and again, this may be inconsequential, but our country follows the stamping out recommendations that again aren't required by World Organization for Animal Health. We follow the stamping out policy. I
Yeah.
Googled
And we
um,
developed that policy,
that.
by the way, not the World Organization for Animal Health. We
Oh,
decide
Right.
this in Canada. It's not coming as a regulation from the World Organization for Animal Health. We should be
okay.
very clear about that.
So anybody that hears that this is a requirement to the World Organization for Animal Health, that simply is not true. This is our
Correct.
policy. This is
That's
our
correct.
policy. And anybody that's, if you go back to, sorry, now we get political, the night of the election, Prime Minister Carney said in his speech that resonated with me, I thought it was so wonderful. We decide what happens here.
Right.
We decide what happens. Our prime minister said that, and we did. So I Googled, and
Mhm.
we go with the stamping out policy. Mexico doesn't.
Mhm.
They don't have a stamping out policy, yet we import pork from Mexico. And pork, I learned, can get avian flu. It's not
Yes.
just, is it kind of a contradiction that we must follow our stamping out policy, but we bring food in from a country that doesn't? Isn't that kind of contradicting itself?
Well, I mean, as I said, the CFIA recognizes that if you have a contamination with H5N1 and it gets into our food system, it actually isn't really a threat because, as you pointed out, you cook the food. People don't generally eat raw meat. Uh, so the situation is that, yes, it really depends on what the organization, the country decides. Sometimes they do this on the basis of limiting trade to protect their own markets, right? So I don't think that this is really a big uh,
Well, no, and I guess my point is just our policy is just one more example of our policy being, it's
inconsistent.
not a policy. It's not a policy. If we either
Outdated.
stick to it or we don't.
Mhm. Yeah.
I guess my question is, um, what are we as Canadians supposed to believe? What do you, as both you experts, say to me and to anybody watching this who are pretty devastated, untrusting, and confused now? What happens next?
I'll let David start off and then I'll follow.
Well, I've been quiet for a while here. Um, um, two things first. Going back, all of this HPIA highly pathogenic terms is based on how the virus reacts in chickens. Okay, and those will die off fast, get sick easily. A farm bird lives average of about 8 weeks, and then it's cold for food, and so those birds have a very weak immune system and get sick easy and fast. Ostriches are completely different bird. They're much larger. It's a much more robust immune system, and so if the birds were sick, we would know it. There was a avian flu on the farm last December. Some birds died. All of the older birds, which had seen avian flu in the past, survived and didn't get sick. And so it's really sad to see a policy for poultry be used for much larger birds on a research farm, and not even used for food. Now in the chickens themselves, and bird wise, we go, oh, avian influenza is bad and have to cook things well. How about other things like salmonella, eh, and then they uncooked bird 10 and will make people sick, and so, and two, last fall all these birds were tested for is just avian influenza, and that's it. So it's a very narrow focused thing of just looking at avian flu. If they're sick, wipe out those birds. Now, in the weeks before the call, birds were going missing. I received a report from CFIA, and it said one bird died of a pre-existing condition on October 4th, which we knew was traumatized and hurt, and was killed. And then it said zero birds have been euthanized by the CFIA. Zero live birds have been removed the farm by the CFIA, and zero birds have been removed from the farm by zero dead birds. So the birds were going missing. Um, and it's kind of ironic as well. All of the female birds were going, and mostly the males were um um left, and it's possible those birds weren't killed. There, there's a ostrich research farm in Red Deer, Alberta, and in back, both of those have ties to CFIA. So it's quite interesting knowing where the birds actually went to. As for how these birds were te tested, uh, I did a large write up on that on October 9th. I gave you the Substack link, and it's really quite um ironic that CFI only tested for H5N1 and flu, and that's it. They didn't look for other things like pseudo moan than this, which the farm has dealt with in the past. And two, when they tested the birds, they have not disclosed to us any of the testing algorithms used. What test was used? Is this a gel-based test or a real-time test? And as well, the testing, the lab has not disclosed and shown use of a ostrich housekeeping gene. And therefore, there's poor chain of custody between the farm and the testing lab. There's no actual housekeeping gene used, and so a a housekeeping gene is a host gene like people, ostrich, chicken, which if you test from that species, it should amplify up positive. It's it, it's a PCR amplification con, con, control to ensure all of the tests are working fine, and therefore there's no actual evidence that what was actually tested came out of ostriches on that farm. Any thoughts on that, Steve?
Yeah. Well, I think in answer to Blake's question, where do we go from here? A couple of points to finish off. I mean, well, firstly, what's the compensation for the farmers uh,
Nothing.
of the ostrich farm? Theoretically, according to CFI policy, they don't have to give them anything because they in the minds of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency did not cooperate. They went to court. The compensation that's the guidelines that were drawn up by the CFIA is about $3,000 an ostrich. And the courts have ruled that it should be $3,000 an ostrich. However, the actual value of these ostriches to replace them is probably closer to about $9,000 to $10,000. So that's one thing. The other is I did test in my lab with the test we developed for H5 and N1 proteins, antibodies, that these birds, we had 18 eggs. The eggs of the ostrich actually contain in their yolks antibodies. So if the birds have antibodies, it shows up in their egg yolk. And we tested 18 eggs from birds that had been, laid these eggs last year in the summer. So this is before the infection. And we could tell that all of those eggs had antibodies against H5 and N1 proteins. So the birds already on the farm at the time of the infection had a significant level of immunity. And the older birds that have been on the farm for more than a couple of years, none of them succumbed to the disease. So that's probable that they were in fact protected. It was the newer birds that were brought into the property subsequently that actually became infected and died.
Hmm.
So you have a a herd immunity that was already to a large extent going on in that population. They were likely infected by H5N1 multiple times in the last few years during the pandemic, and that's probably why they had the antibodies. Now,
Mhm.
here's the thing, those eggs, and one hen can lay easily 35 eggs in a season. And ostrich antibodies are extremely um, stable. They can take almost boiling and very acidic or basic conditions. So these antibodies are ideal for industrial purposes. For example, to coat masks to capture the virus before it can be breathed in, or in filters in facilities where maybe like on the farms where you want to reduce the level of the virus that might be in the environment in the air. Um, they could be used for therapeutic purposes. They could be used for diagnostic purposes. So, because my company, Connexus, actually produces antibodies, we do it in rabbits. We know what the commercial value is for a good antibody. And I estimated that each egg, if it had a valuable target, and I think H5 and N1 proteins, and these birds were already being used in research to develop antibodies against SARS-CoV-2 virus spike protein, these antibodies per egg are tens of thousands of dollars worth of product in those eggs.
Correct.
And so the CFIA destroyed all the eggs. So here we had a huge source of antibodies that could have been used to protect other poultry farms from the virus. And they just destroyed it. And an egg is normally a sterile container. So
Mhm.
as long as it isn't cracked, there will be no virus in the egg and in its yolk. So this is a tremendous waste. There's, from what we can tell, no compensation to the farmers for the destruction of hundreds of eggs. And at the same time, I guess to the final question, where do we go from here? Well, I think the birds have been called. It's been a traumatic e- event for not only the farmers, but for many, many people, tens of thousands of people in Canada, that they can't believe that we would do such a horrific thing. For in fact, the scientific basis of it was so poor, and the potential of what could have come from these birds to help us fight the virus was basically destroyed, not taken advantage of. I think what it's revealed is a lot of issues with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency as a government agency and how it's run, its operations, and I think there has to be a complete reevaluation of that entire department so that we actually get back to what makes scientific sense, financial sense, and also ethical sense. And so this has opened a can of worms that basically is not going away until it's actually solved. So I think that's where we're at, Blake.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yeah,
Um,
that was what. Go ahead, David. Sorry.
as for where to go, it's been very sad to see all of this unfold. I've heard that CFIA might try and and lay all of the bills and the cost of this on to the farm, which would be horrible and sad. I agree that CFIA is using outdated policies, and the whole organization needs to be re-examined, refocused. kissed and actually follow science and not just old outdated policies. At the same time, we've got our legacy media people out there who only listen and talk to one side, and it's been the same too. Angela Rasmussen and Scott Weiss, and both I find are very unprofessional, immoral, and celebrated the call. And if you're like us, evaluating actual science, that they want you canceled fully. So I think that we need to ensure that the actual facts are being shared and not just one side of what the government wants told.
Which is an uphill battle when news medias are what they are. Interesting thought. Your point as well. You're probably both aware. Critter Raid and Summerland's going through the same issue right now. They culled some ducks, and some ducks and chickens had died, but they're fighting to save some peacocks that the CFIA has ordered killed. And as just before we went on to the Zoom, I started researching peacocks, and they're not unlike ostriches. In captivity, they live 40 to 50 years. And when you ask the question about immune system, it's like it's the exact same situation as the ostriches, robust immune system. But here the CFIA wants them dead.
Well, except there any evidence of those birds actually being infected and being infectious? There's absolutely none. And so when you and and others say that, oh, if you test them and it comes back negative, the virus could be hiding out. That's not evidence at all. That's not following fact that says, are these birds infectious or aren't they? If someone like us is infected infectious and you test, it'll come up positive. If you test post symptoms 2 or 3 times and you get a negative result each time, you can be sure that they're no longer infectious, and therefore, if you don't want to test and go, oh, a negative test can just be dismissed. It basically evaluates the testing at all, and you're working off of pure speculation, and that's it, and not actual facts. If those birds contain a a virus or not. And avian influenza is endemic in the wild waterfowl population. It spreads flew between the northern and southern hemispheres for the past hundreds of years. As Steve rightly said, on in the past 10 years, there's been a handful of cases, and therefore to if culling 20 million chickens has not slowed down avian influenza, killing off 400 healthy ostriches or peacocks has done absolutely nothing. So it's
Yeah.
a pushing of science, of government policy, and not scientific fact.
And if people get influenza and they get sick, and it happens all the time, and
Yep,
they recover, most people, 99% will recover from an influenza infection. Um, 2 weeks later, we consider them completely safe. I
exactly.
mean, even a couple of days later, they go back to work, and we don't see them as a threat because we know from experience that they're not infectious. So to kill these birds 10 months after they've fully recovered is just insane.
Well, that's the part that I found so confusing. I'd see Angela Rasmussen, for example, in one news report say that shedding can go on for years,
Yeah,
and then a
nonsense.
month later, a month earlier, say they're healthy, and we're okay. Well, which one is it? So,
Yeah,
can you
yeah.
explain shedding? Can you get the concept and
Yes, there are some animals that when they get infected do not get sick. And so, for example, we had the Black Death, the bubonic plague. Basically, you had a Yersinia pestis would infect rats, but the rats wouldn't die. But the fleas that ate, that fed on the blood of the rats, then fed on the blood of people, and people died from Yersinia. So you have some species that could be carriers that could transmit. However, if you have a species that actually does get sick and die, which these ostriches are clearly just like the chickens in this regard, they're not carriers. They're actually a susceptible population to being killed. Now, as it turns out, with these ostriches, if they were shedding, it could be easily tested with a PCR test. The CFIA refused to do any further testing beyond from none of the live animals. Only those two birds from December of last year is the only official testing results that they've released. Now, I suspect they have been testing the birds. I suspect that prior to the call, if any of them had H5N1, we would have learned about it,
Oh yeah.
but none of them had it. And so we are not aware of those test results. I think there will be some sort of freedom of information request to get a lot more information about how the CFI actually handled this, what tests they did. And as that information becomes available to the public, I think they're going to be shocked.
it's funny. Angela Rasmussen said that it's dangerous to test the birds, but the farm said, "Well, no, we do tests on them all the time." And then she also said, I found this one interesting about a week and a half ago, that you could test one part of the bird, but the avian flu could be in another part. not the part you tested.
No, that's just complete
Nonsense.
BS.
I thought
You can test for
I
virus in wastewater. I mean, that's what our community health, services like the BC Center for Disease Control does. It takes wastewater to test whether or not the COVID-19 virus, SARS-CoV-2, is in the community. I mean, this is complete nonsense. Uh, I don't even know where she gets that kind of strange information from. Yeah, it demonstrates, I hate to say it, but a high degree of naivety on her part as a scientist and spokesperson on this. Her credibility is really shot from my perspective.
Yeah.
gentlemen, guys, thank you very much. I hope people watch this. And again, I asked you where we go from here, and I don't know where the farm goes.
Mhm. Well, it's not over.
Is yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you, guys. I appreciate this. We all do.
Thank you very much, Blake, for the opportunity. And
Take care.
thank you to your listeners for
Yeah.
tuning in.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you. See you.